Welcome back, everybody. This is Lecture 3, The Origins of Sociology and the Break with Tradition. Um, got a new setup here. Hopefully the production value is a step up from the last one, which is pretty horrible. I apologize for that. I am not a movie guy. So in this lection, we examine the historical context surrounding the origins of the discipline of sociology, and we do this as a way of understanding the types of concerns, types of questions, and approaches taken by early sociologists. The late 18th and 19th centuries set the substantive agenda as well as the methodological content for sociology, and this continued into the 20th century and today. Sociology has its origins in the transition from what I'll refer to as traditional life in Europe to modernity. So the goal of today's lecture is to provide a broad description of these changes and then situate within them the questions and approaches of three prominent early sociologists considered the founding or among the founding figures of the discipline: Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Karl Marx. So I'll talk about the questions that motivated their work, highlight a small sample of how they went about answering those questions, their methodological approaches, and some core concepts. This is far from an exhaustive treatment of these sociologists' work. This is very much an introduction. One other important caveat is that while Weber, Marx, and Durkheim are widely recognized as founding figures in sociology, they aren't the only important early sociologists. So I'm leaving out other notable figures. Jane Addams, who was a social reformer in Chicago around the turn of the 20th century, who was deeply concerned with poverty, inequality, and urban life in American cities. I'm also leaving out W.E.B. Du Bois, who was actually the first American sociologist, the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, and really the first American to really engage in the sociology as an empirical enterprise. So again, the point here is this is very much an introduction to social theory and the history of sociology. An introduction, not a conclusion. Okay, so let's go to slide 2. This is the plan for today. I should have had this slide up already. Okay, so the context motivates these early thinkers, and then we'll talk about who those are. Let's go on to slide 3. In simple terms, sociology emerged as part of this transition from traditional to modern life, and those two concepts are extremely loaded, controversial. There's lots of books written around what is modernity, so I'm just using these as sort of broad categories. So there's a lot of debate and scholarship around what these categories are, as well as the mechanisms by which we transformed, from a traditional way of life to a modern way of life. And then there's, of course, debates over, when exactly does this transition occur, right? What I'm going to use is some broad markers instead, right? So by the 18th century, Europe had been rocked by a series of revolutions: intellectual, political, even spiritual revolutions. The first modern states were born. The first national scale markets that we would recognize as capitalist took form. The organizational scale of society increased and grew larger as control over markets, control over politics, over ideas even. The generation of ideas shifted from being very local towards a national scale. And each of these kinds of changes, these revolutions, contributed to a broad movement away from traditional forms of life, away from religious authority, and towards humanism, towards secularism, towards science, away from an agrarian economy towards one defined more by markets, by industrialism, and away from traditional modes of authority rooted in bloodlines, kinship ties, as well as rooted in the church, and towards systems of political domination rooted in rational legal procedures, right? The modern bureaucratic welfare state. Okay, so I want to say a few words about these transformations before discussing how sociology developed to better understand them. So this is the key sort of juncture where people start asking, what are the dynamics of society? We need to consider the systematic study of social life. So at the end of the Middle Ages, history was not intelligible in terms of human actions, right? I'm trying to give a sense of the magnitude of this change from traditional to modernity life. In this medieval traditional way of life, the ultimate causes and meaning of historical events on Earth were understood by Christian minds to lie in the supernatural world, in the cosmos, in the sort of eternal sequence of Christian time. Right, the unfolding of events of history was the province of God, not humans. Humans didn't make history. It was the cosmos. It was God that turned things, literally turned the earth. That's a bad metaphor here, but it wasn't humans that made things happen. It was cosmic forces. Now, this is not to say that the Middle Ages were irrational. Right? Within that medieval worldview, nature was intelligible. It could be subject to rationality. So that is, nature was orderly. Farmers knew the progression of the seasons, the changing length of night and day. People could plan. People understood the movement of the stars. And this is, of course, a very old enterprise at this point. But the key is how these patterns, natural patterns, seasonal changes, whatnot, were understood. The succession of particular events that constituted history could only be understood as pure chance or as fate, as repetitive and timeless, customary, if you will, or perhaps the occasional scene of divine intervention into life. The fundamental point is that history was not understood as driven by human will, human choices, agency, but instead humans were a part of this much broader cosmic unfolding of time and God's plan. So this is a description of traditional society, a society organized through tradition, custom, and through faith. Perhaps a heavy dose of mythology. So this slide I'm showing you here on slide 4 is a representation of the cosmos as a domain of God and Jesus and the apostles. They're up there in the universe, sort of directing human affairs. And so this is a cosmos that cares about human life, about human existence. It's God directly involved in the management of and guidance of human life. Now, this image itself is pretty interesting. It's actually a very old image that depicts the cosmos, and the image actually precedes the rise of Christianity. The creator of this image in the 17th century simply took out the pagan gods and inserted Christian ones. It was produced by a man named Julius Schiller right around the 1620s. So, with the rise of science and humanism, and by that I mean basically just increased attention to human affairs, human values and concerns rather than and distinct from theological ones. There's a weird edit there. Okay, so the rise of science and humanism, right, increased attention to human values, human concerns as distinct from theological ones, comes a decline of religious authority. The rise of science. So, let's go on to this slide. The quote in the slide is from a historian, R.R. Palmer. He wrote the textbook that I used in AP European History in high school. This quote says, the scientific revolution has been called the greatest spiritual adjustment that human beings have ever been required to make. Okay? So just sort of emphasize how the thoroughgoing nature of these revolutions. They're scientific, they're industrial, they're intellectual, and they're spiritual. They're about who we are, who we think we are in the universe. So here, let me quote Palmer again on the significance of the Enlightenment. He says, "The old heavens were exploded. Humans were no longer the center of creation. The luminaries of the sky no longer shone to light their way, to give them beauty. The old cosmos, comfortably enclosed and ranked in an ascending order of purity, gave way to a new cosmos, which seemed to consist of an infinite emptiness through which particles of matter were distributed. Humans were the puny denizens of a material object, swinging in space, along with every other very distant material object of the same kind. About the physical universe, there was nothing especially Christian, nothing that God portrayed in the Bible would likely have made. So the ultimate authority of God and religion began to lose its grip on people's thinking and to be increasingly replaced by humanist and scientific thought. So science stole away the mystery of the world and sort of sealed the death knell of magic, of spirit, of fate. So Blaise Pascal, who was a Christian but also a notable mathematician in the 17th century, he was a big advocate of the scientific method, but he has some ambivalence about that. He wrote in reference to the cosmos, to the celestial world of stars and planets, as he was understanding it as a science. He said, "I am terrified by the eternal silence of these infinite processes. The universe is no longer a comfortable, caring place. There's no one there looking out after human beings. Human beings find themselves alone in the cosmos and faced with existential questions about the meaning and purpose of life." So while humanity was removed from the center of the cosmos by science, humanity also laid claim to new kinds of powers, to master nature, to reconstruct the social order. So now, where nature and history were viewed in the past as sort of inevitable, as the machinations of God and spirits, nature became understood as something to be manipulated, to be engineered, and so with it, society as well. So this is the kernel of the rather optimistic and progressive notion that humanity could perfect itself through the application of human reason to natural and social problems. So that's the birth of the scientific worldview, and also the sort of very progressive orientation of science in general, and also the social sciences in particular. And the spread of the scientific worldview transformed Europeans, transformed them from fatalists into progressives in that sense of problem solving. I don't mean it in a political sense. Changed them from people at the mercy of God, or gods perhaps, to someone who is in control of himself or herself and is in control of nature. So the Enlightenment unleashes this worldview, and it decisively breaks with the authority, the traditional authority of the church, of religion, and it contributed to radical transformations in Europe, including the birth of sociology in a couple of different ways. Let's go on to the next slide, slide 6. So here's a few ways that the Enlightenment directly contributed to sociology. I think it indirectly contributes in a number of other ways that I'll talk about. Well, it prevented. So the first way is it generated profound social change. Life in medieval Europe was relatively stable and consistent for 1,000 years, less than 1,000 years, but about 1,000 years. And suddenly, over a 400-year period, dramatic changes take place. So the Enlightenment triggers the technical and scientific advances of the Industrial Revolution. In breaking with the traditional authority of the church, it laid the groundwork for new theories about human existence, about the place of human beings in the cosmos, but also the place of human beings in worldly affairs, in very local social ways. The relationships between people changed, right? And so it's in this context that we see the rise of political liberalism, natural law, natural rights, where the idea that human beings have certain powers that are rooted in the very nature of human beings as biological actors, endowed with the capacity for reason. But this leads to the idea that human beings are naturally endowed with rights. They can't be abridged, and I guess this is the important point. Human beings naturally possess rights, and they can't be abridged even by the king or the pope. Right? These are rights independent of existent political structures. So in this way, the Enlightenment contributes to political revolutions in France, the United States. The Declaration of Independence announces, this is a quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. These rights that they're referring to are self-evident. They're rooted in natural law. That is, they're rooted in the natural dynamics of the world, of the universe, of which human beings are a part. This is the impetus to revolt, to make radical changes. We can now make the future. We can declare our rights. It's no longer fate. And we're guided by our natural capacity for reason. So in terms of sociology, the early sociologists that I will talk about embraced the scientific method. They decisively broke with theological explanations of social order, and they began to study history as the product not of divine will or intervention, but as the product of human action. People make history. So human social life began to be viewed as not only patterned and variable, but subject to empirical laws that could be studied in a manner comparable to physics. So the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution influenced the field of sociology by transforming society in massive and disruptive ways that the first sociologists sought to understand. It also provided them with a paradigm, and this is now the second piece, which is that a model of knowledge based not on divine revelation or the Bible, but on the scientific method, and specifically the scientific method as modeled by biology. That point will come up again when I talk about Comte and Durkheim. So let me talk briefly about the Industrial Revolution, another of these revolutions that occurred in this rather condensed period of history. It first took hold in England in the 17th century and then spread from there. And today it's continuing to unfold in various parts of the world. It did and continues to be even today to generate massive social upheaval. So the invention of the steam engine, this is sort of the classic marker for the invention, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, allowed the British to, specifically the British textile industry, to start generating large quantities of new textiles. There's a whole story here about England's colonial domination of India and how they reconfigured Indian society to seize control of the production of textiles. That's an aside. The point here is that this growth of the textile industry and the industrial textile production created large demands for wool, and British elites responded by taking direct ownership of common lands and turning them into pastures for sheep. In the process, they pauperized the bulk of English subjects for traditional life in England had for centuries involved common ownership or common use of land. And this ends around the Industrial Revolution, and the peasantry is dispossessed from access to common land. They had made, like I say, made their life that way as serfs for centuries. So this becomes known as the enclosure movement, fencing off the pasture land to keep the peasants out. And as a result, there's a migration from rural areas to new cities. And so we see the birth of really large urban agglomerations around this time. So this is a marker of a general social change that occurred as the result of industrialization. The movement of the peasantry, living in rural areas, into new, cramped, pre-modern cities where the former peasantry would become new urban proletariats, new urban workers. So this introduces a whole new category. Here we see some children working on textile looms well, I'm not actually sure the date of this. Anyway, children workers doing textiles. Urbanization triggers a whole new set of really novel social problems that had not been encountered in Europe for at least for a long time. Put these problems on the agenda, not only of public, but of social scientists in particular. So here's some images. So this slide, on slide 10, which is hard to see on the screen, we're looking at the population growth of London. So the population of London just balloons, right at the end of the 19th century, and we get new social problems. Here, a depiction of the environmental degradation associated with industrialism. And this is one of my favorites, a rat pit. Basically there's so many rats that you throw them into a pit, and then they would drop a terrier in there, and people would make bets as to how many rats the terrier can kill in a certain amount of time. There's a great scene from, very brief but great, in The Gangs of New York, where they depict this sort of, bring your date, let's go to the rat pits and watch a terrier eat them. But this is telling, right? And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's indicative of urban social life. Dense urban environments lacking adequate sanitation, that there's an abundance of rats, and also disease, that the rats are carriers, that it becomes, there's a kind of spectator sport. Urbanization is also associated with transformations of family structure, a movement towards more what we would recognize as nuclear families. There's a relaxation of traditional gender roles, as many women are now employed in factories. There's a rise of new kinds of organizations, the large firm, right? Here we have the birth of the multinational corporation in some of the the East India Trading Company is the first sort of multinational, and not necessarily that one, but that sort of style, these chartered businesses. We also see the rise of the modern state as really consolidating power at the national level, increasingly building large bureaucratic structures to maintain the state, allow it to function rather consistently over time. We also have the rise of labor markets, paid work, money economies, the demise of economies largely based on subsistence and barter. The basic point here is that industrialism transformed social life in dramatic ways, introduces new ways of living as well as new kinds of problems, and each of these changes provides fodder for this new discipline of sociology. So we've talked about sort of spiritual, intellectual revolutions, industrial revolutions, and finally there are political revolutions. Of course, this is a picture of the storming of the Bastille. And the French Revolution of 1789 was by far the most momentous of an age of political upheaval. At the time of the French Revolution, unlike the United States, which was a kind of backwater in the European world, France was one of the most powerful countries in the world at the time. It's one of the richest countries in the world at the time. And it sort of exploded, and the old order, the ancient regime, just collapses over an extended period, 20 years, maybe a little longer, but in the sweep of history, a relatively condensed amount of time. And the French Revolution sort of unleashed these very radically progressive forces: science, industry, radical politics, and they threw off the fetters of aristocratic domination, aristocratic politics, religious symbolism, and authority. So just to sort of give an example of this is one of the themes or prominent symbols of the French Revolution, the guillotine. And the guillotine embraces these new values, these radical values that come out of the French Revolution and inaugurate a new age of the forms that political domination takes. So the guillotine is a social leveling technology. It is an example of how the French Revolution sort of unleashed these powers of science and reason and put them to use in the idea of equality. It seems weird talking about the guillotine, but under the old regime, wealth could affect the manner by which people were executed. Right? The wealthy had money to pay bribes to the executioner to ensure, that death was quick and relatively painless. Don't use the dull axe, use the sharp one, please. Don't take multiple swings, get the job done in one take. The guillotine levels those kinds of class distinctions when it comes to death. So we can think of this as representing the political values of the revolution: liberty, equality, brotherhood. We're all condemned to the same fate, I guess. And it sought to end a society organized around ascription, ascribed status, or the idea that status is regulated through the accidents of birth. We'll talk more about achieved status versus ascribed status when we talk about class, social class. So in its place, we have the birth of democracy, the idea of individual political rights, along with an embrace of reason in science. All these values represent this transformation from traditional to modern life. In a sense, the guillotine is a technology of modern democracy. Everybody dies the same. So for the sociologists, let's go on to the next slide. The French Revolution was a clear demonstration of the mutability of science, its potential to the mutability of society, and its potential to devolve into utter chaos. And it really forced this question, which is, well, what maintains social order? What keeps it from falling apart into this anarchy and bloodshed of the French Revolution? Now, at the same time, the French Revolution, is sort of a marker of a broader transformation in political life. We have the birth of a variety of new isms, if you will: liberalism, nationalism, constitutionalism, feminism, socialism, communism. Right? So we see a sort of flourishing of intellectual diversity. And this is a contrast to the relative homogeny of thought in traditional life, and that thought was largely religious and theological, Christian and theological in orientation, right? But now we see this proliferation of different ideas, and it's a sort of rationalized. When we start to organize that diversity of ideas into camps, the socialists, the communists, the liberals, the conservatives. More importantly, the French Revolution, signaled to the new sociologists that there's a question to be asked here, right? That we need to pay attention to human actions and how humans make history, how humans force historical events and change. And we will see this particularly in the works of Marx, that history is the domain within which humanity works out its destiny. So we need a science of human history, so that as the means to create a social order that is just, that isn't going to collapse into anarchy, etc. Okay, so let me conclude this first half of the lecture. These revolutions, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the various political revolutions, created massive upheaval in Europe. Secularization, secular worldviews increasingly displace religion and dominate intellectually in terms of how human beings understand the human condition, and also practically in terms of the kinds of institutions that began to dominate society. It's the firm and the state, not the church. Agrarian economies declined and industrial economies grew. Peasants became proletariats. Farmers became urban dwellers. Family life was transformed along with traditional gender roles, and new giant bureaucracies arose in business and the state. And these constituted a new form of authority, bureaucratic authority, legal, rational authority, as opposed to religious authority. And these new forms of bureaucratic authority began to affect people's lives in more and more immediate ways. Status hierarchies were upended. And with that, new openings emerged for achieved status, for economic mobility. The new classes rose. I talked about this the first lecture, the rise of the merchants. And the relatively homogeneous, shared worldview of the Middle Ages fragmented and were replaced by a diversity of new competing ideologies. In response to all of these changes, developed a line of scientific scholarship that became known as sociology. Okay, so let me start with Auguste Comte. Comte was a 19th century French writer, and he's most known, and probably this is the reason I'm talking about him, is he coined the term sociology. Now, he was born right after the French Revolution, 9 years after. It was 9 years after it broke out, and it was less than a year before Napoleon seized power. So he was born right into the midst of this upheaval. Comte, like many of the French sociologists that would follow immediately after him, was concerned about this upheaval, this disorder in society. And he sought to find a scientific theory that would lead to more rational, less chaotic social orders. And so here, this is a primary theme of sociology. I've touched on it already, but we might call it the problem of integration. And so this is they follow a model laid out by biology, and this is true for Comte. It's also true for Durkheim and others. And this model that they follow from biology is this. It's the idea that human society is like an organism. We're like an ant colony, or perhaps like a cell, just a single-celled organism. So we can call Comte an organicist, because he thought of society as a social organ, like an organ of the body. So he asked, what allows society to hang together, to be a cohesive, functional, and I use that word functional specifically, a functional entity. So this becomes later known as the functionalist paradigm, because this question. the task of sociology is to discern what a given phenomena, social phenomena, what is its function for the perpetuation of society. So it's a paradigm that's concerned with how institutions or practices contribute to the operation and the persistence of society over time as an integrated whole. And they assumed that everything that exists, from law to poverty to the structure of families, has a function in perpetuating social life. So, in a sense, our social institutions are evolutionary adaptations of the social organ that allows it to persist over time. You can see how social Darwinists pick up on this theme. So from Comte's point of view, traditional society of the Middle Ages was a well-integrated, cohesive, functional society. But those revolutions that I've just talked about threatened that equilibrium, or destroyed that equilibrium, and created chaos and dysfunctionality. So Comte, he's a believer in the scientific method, so another way in which sociology drew off of biology and the physical sciences. He also coined the term positivism, and we'll talk more about positivism later. But the basic idea is this is the idea that scientific knowledge, that is knowledge rooted in experience, empirical data, which is derived from direct experience, that this kind of knowledge is the only certain form of knowledge, and therefore it is the preferred form of knowledge. So contrast to both theological modes of knowledge, knowledge rooted in divination, in spirituality. It's also distinct from metaphysics and the dominant mode of philosophy at that time, which was concerned with questions of, what is good, for instance. A strict positive seeks to find general rules of society that cross social context and persist over time. Right? So in a sense, it's a social physics that Comte was trying to find, that he's trying to find the social sort of laws of society comparable to the laws of gravity. They're just stable, persistent, that's how it is. Okay. That's a vision of sociology that existed well into the 20th century, and there are certain manners in which it continues to exist today, but positivist approaches are much more moderated today than this sort of strong version of it. Let's go on. Let's talk about Durkheim. So Durkheim was also born in France. He was born 1 year after the death of Comte. But like Comte, he was concerned for this problem of social integration. But he goes much further, and where basically the point of talking about Comte today is because he's the guy that coined sociology. Sociologists today still read Durkheim. As a graduate student, you will spend a lot of time, graduate student in sociology will spend a considerable amount of time with Durkheim's original texts. I continue to refer back to them in various ways as well. So that's to say, founding figures still relevant to the discipline today. So Durkheim discussed a change from traditional society to modern society in terms of what he called social solidarity. Now, by social solidarity, he means the moral bonds that tie people together into groups. It's that feeling of belonging or membership that can arise in the context of families, sports teams, religious groups, really anywhere. It's what that feeling that pulls us together into groups. So what Durkheim calls mechanical solidarity occurs in rather undifferentiated societies. Think hunter-gatherers. These are societies where people tend to do the same things and have the same roles. There's a little hierarchy, and important here, they have a shared moral universe, right? Everybody has the same ideas about what's wrong, what's right, what's appropriate. people in these with mechanical solidarity literally have a shared consciousness in that sense, that everybody, it's not even articulated. This all exists at that level of taken for granted understandings about how the world works, about what is good, what is bad, what ought to be done. So that form of solidarity is a sense of belonging, a membership, because we're all the same. It's integration through sameness, solidarity through sameness. Modernity, however, makes society much more complex. We have a more elaborate division of labor. And what I mean by that is that in modern society, we tend to be, our occupations tend to be highly specialized, and that means that people are quite different. I'm a professor. I rely on other people to make food, make clothes, do a whole bunch of other stuff. But yet, given the importance of a college degree and upward mobility in this society, people depend on me for certain other things. So it's a complex division of labor because we're each highly specialized. And that gives us different positions in the world and makes us all different. In modern society, we are more individualistic than in traditional society. So people are no longer the same. We no longer have a shared collective conscious where we all have taken for granted ideas about what is good and bad and what ought to be done. Custom doesn't carry the same weight as it did in traditional society, right? Instead, we're much more individualism. We can think of individualism as one of those isms that emerge out of these revolutions alongside liberalism and communism, feminism. So, in modern society, individuals have more agency, groups are relatively weaker, and this creates a kind of problem. People no longer have the same roles. If we no longer have the same shared ideas about what is good and bad and what is right and how problems should be handled, then why doesn't society fall apart? Why don't we devolve into anarchy and chaos like what happened in the French Revolution? In fact, right, that's the problem. That's sort of the diagnosis by Durkheim and others of the French Revolution, is that there was a weakening of social bonds that led to anomie, to a loss of purpose, and with that, chaos and violence. So what holds society together in modern society? So his answer for that is what he calls organic solidarity. And this organic solidarity is rooted in interdependence. And this interdependence is what characterizes modern societies. So I am actually, not only am I specialized as a professor, and I am actually dependent for my continued existence on other people, on the people that make the food and the clothes and the houses and all the other stuff that we as individuals require in modern life. So modern life, the form of solidarity and integration into group, occurs through interdependence in modern life. That's his notion of organic solidarity. Now, in terms of Durkheim's approach, he argued, and I ask you to read a little bit of this excerpt on his rules of method, I believe for next time. He developed this notion of a social fact. And this is important for how Durkheim conceived of what sociology is, because it's sociology that has this unique object of study that is the social fact. So law is an example of a social fact. It's a social fact, and these are sort of the general criteria of social facts, that they're outside of us, right? We experience the law as something I didn't make the law, right? It exists externally to me. The law isn't a creation even of my generation, but it's something that existed that when I was born into it. So it's a given, pre-existing sort of condition for human agency. Social facts are resistant to the will of individuals. Okay? So whatever I think about the laws doesn't really matter, right? The law is going to continue to exist. Even if I disobey it. So we can think about other social facts, right? I talked about the labor market is a kind of social fact that exists externally to the individual. And we could go on and on. There's a lot of social facts. Most institutions should be considered social facts. The point is that social facts point to complex social relationships. The law isn't an object. It's a set of relationships between people that takes a certain form. And so Durkheim argued we can study the law to learn about social relationships. And so we study social facts to understand social structures and patterns of social life. In fact, Durkheim studies the law a lot to learn about how solidarity has changed by studying how punishment, for instance, was meted out in different ways over time. So law, social facts in general, tell us about the moral bonds that hold society together. And this is important. Social facts are important because Durkheim viewed them as objective, right? He doesn't need to get into people's minds to understand how people view the world, understand the world. He simply looks at these artifacts of social relations, which are objective in his world, or in his approach. So Durkheim charges this new discipline of sociology with studying social facts as things. And this is going to be the basis of a new science. Okay, I've added a link to this slide that takes you to a brief YouTube video that's I thought it was useful in explaining what he means by solidarity as well as the different forms of it that he theorized. Okay, let's go on and talk about Marx. So like Comte, like Durkheim, Marx was concerned about social change and the kinds of effects that it has on people. But in sharp contrast to both Comte and Durkheim, he did not operate with this assumption that society was like an organism. Instead, he is associated with what would become later on referred to as the conflict paradigm of social thought. So for Marx, history progresses through power struggles between classes over the control of resources, specifically economic resources. So he calls himself a materialist, and what he means by that is that the fundamental motors of social change are economic relationships, the relationships that shape the very literal reproduction of human life. So history doesn't change through intellectual ideas, through law, through philosophy. It changes by who controls those material assets that we require to live. Religion also is sort of epiphenomena for him. For him, religion, law, culture in general, largely serves as ideology. And what, in this sense, he means by that is that it serves to distract the people, particularly the working class, the proletariat, those that are exploited. These things distract them from understanding the true character of their situation in society and their place in history. So for Marx, the factory was really the core institution of modern society. It's the sort of linchpin in the institutional arrangements that allowed capitalism to develop and flourish. And that specifically that allows a small group of the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, to extract wealth out of the labor of a mass of working people. So this is the core idea. This materialist view is the core idea behind the Communist Manifesto, right? And that's why I asked you to read it. He writes in there that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It's the history of people fighting over material assets, those things we need to live. And he concludes that essay with the famous call to arms. Working men of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Okay, so the contrast between Marx and Durkheim couldn't, I don't think, be clearer. Rather than Marx isn't concerned about social integration. He's not concerned how to create new institutions that would foster solidarity like Comte was, Durkheim as well. Instead, Marx theorizes revolutionary transformation, overthrowing of the class structure, and as a stepping stone to this very common Enlightenment ideal of a more perfect society in which men and women could meet their basic needs in an unalienated and self-fulfilling manner. We're gonna perfect society through the application of reason. That's Marx's agenda right there, as well as most everybody else, every common thinker, every other sort of prominent thinker of the time. So in his analysis of the alienation of the worker and the relationship between classes, he didn't treat people as sort of blindly following universal laws, right? So he's not a positivist in the manner of Kant. He's not developing a social physics. Rather, his account of the workings of capitalism, Marx advanced the position that the structures of modern social life, the structures of capitalism, impose certain requirements on economic actors, but those requirements are not determinate. Right? There is nothing inevitable or transcendent about social relationships and the possibility for change. Everything is much more contextual, historicized. And for Marx, the structures of society are often contradictory, right? They're not fully worked out and rational. There's contradictions built in, and it's those contradictions that are the real source or the triggers for change. So an example of this contradiction, the impoverishment of the working class. Right? Capitalism enables this class competition in which the elites extract wealth out of the alienated working of workers, but this creates a contradiction, right, for the worker who is working hard but being impoverished for it, and it's that contradiction that leads to the radical change. That's what motivates the revolution. Okay, so that sows the seeds of transformation. Okay, so there's no social law, or perhaps the only social law is that societies have contradictions that will be the trigger for social change. But what those contradictions may be, how they might be seized, and whether or not they actually are historical questions, not sort of these transcendent laws of society kind of thing. So I think from Marx we get a really sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individuals and society, the relationship between structure and agency, as well as this important, I think, recognition that society's social relationships can be contradictory, and that they don't function as harmonious social organisms. Okay? There's nothing, societies never are in equilibrium, according to Marx. So very different assumptions between him and Durkheim. Okay, Max Weber. Again, like Durkheim, Marx, and Weber, if you go to graduate school of sociology, you're going to spend a considerable amount of time with Max Weber. Now, there's a lot to Weber, and I'm only, he's associated with ideas like disenchantment, legitimate authority, bureaucracy, the iron cage of rationalization, and each of these are very rich, subtle concepts that I don't have the time to really explore. So I want to just sort of focus on one, and that's his idea of rationalization. And I think the reason for I'm focusing on that one is that it helps set the context for how he understood this transformation from traditional life to modern life, and what that means for the self. I'm going to talk about bureaucratization and the iron cage of rationality later in the semester. So for Weber, rationalization refers to a shift in values, and it's a shift. This leads to a shift in social order from towards values that favor calculability, predictability, efficiency, and in the form of abstract rules. So I'm going to give you an example. that I'll talk more about later. But in a certain way, he's talking, one way to cut into this is he's talking about law, or law. We think about law today. Law in the books is an exhaustive list of you can do what, who can do what, when, and how, and the limitations on this. But law is written as though it's universal and applies to everybody at all points of time. Laws are not written, to say, you, student number 235 in sociology 210 in the spring semester of 2017 shall not cheat on your exam, right? That's a very specific, substantive form of law. No, laws are more written like students shall not engage in academic dishonesty. It's written in these very sort of abstracted terms. Okay. Here's the example. McDonald's. George Ritzer, the author of our textbook, has written a book called McDonaldization, where he talks about Weber's theories of rationalization. So McDonald's serves billions of hamburgers that are almost identical to each other. And this is an example of the rationalization of food and restaurants. McDonald's pioneered its delivery of hamburgers around these values of calculability and efficiency. Right? The point is to serve as many identical hamburgers to as many people as possible. And the reason to do that is to maximize profit and minimize costs. So it's these very instrumental values of efficiency in service to profit. A strict level of efficiency has been accomplished in McDonald's in a variety of ways. Strict control of the workers' actions, replacement of more complicated systems with simpler, less time-consuming ones. Right? So you don't have a worker who assembles the burger from beginning to end, right? Think of an assembly line. You do one repetitive task over at a time, over and over and over. Very simplified tasks. It doesn't take much judgment or intellectual sophistication. So McDonald's adds a drive-through window to make this process of handing off the burgers more efficient. It makes the seats in the restaurants uncomfortable so that people don't linger. They eat their food and get out of the way. So Weber's argument is that these values of calculation, efficiency, and administration are increasingly coming to typify more and more domains of social life. McDonald's is not an anomaly, but these sorts of values govern a variety of different circumstances. And this rationalization is replacing domains of social life that had previously governed by more customary practices, traditional modes of order. So the most typical form of rationalization in modern society is the bureaucracy. Indeed, we live in an age of bureaucracy. We live our lives embedded in various kinds of bureaucracies, from not only the bureaucracies of the state as citizens, but students as universities, athletes as members of teams and divisions and leagues. Businesses are bureaucracies, fraternities and churches all have a bureaucratic character. We're so enmeshed in these bureaucracies that it's hard to recognize that this is actually a historically novel mode of social organization that arose with this transformation to modernity. It's hard to imagine a life that is, in our society, not centrally oriented in some important fashion to the accumulation of wealth, for instance, right? Or should I say economic survival in even a more sort of minimal sort of way. But instead, it's not common to have lives oriented towards art, towards spiritual realization, towards callings and vocations. That our life has become, human social life has increasingly been oriented towards instrumental values. Living lives in service to higher callings, love, heroism, spiritual realization are uncommon. So this leads us to the particular character of modern social life for Weber. So this is a quote from him. "There are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means in order to master or implore the spirits, as did the savage, for whom such mysterious powers existed. Sorry, my screen went black for a second. Okay. So, for Weber, modern societies have become increasingly characterized by instrumental rationality. And that replaces tradition. Instrumental means it's sort of means-end logic. I'm gonna do this most efficiently to achieve the specific kind of outcome. And this replaces things like myth, belief, emotion, callings, vocation, faith, and replaces them with a kind of this bureaucratic instrumental rationality that tightly joins means to ends in social action. And as we'll see a little bit later, for what's most remarkable about Weber is that he roots this transformation in a transformation of the self. Okay? That it is a transformation of spirit. And he writes this book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, because he's talking about the spiritual basis of modern capitalism. So that's his remarkable insight. There's a rationalization of spiritual belief, a reconstitution of attitudes and feelings in the West about identity, about salvation, about savings. So early Protestants, and he follows the Calvinists in particular, developed the idea that economic success was a marker of spiritual salvation. But that idea, right, that equating spiritual material success as an indication of God's grace eventually becomes secularized. It loses its religious orientation and becomes to be seen as a general orientation to life in a secular society. Now, accumulation of wealth, less a indicator of God's grace, is just a good unto itself. But it had its origins in a religious context, a religious worldview, and became rationalized over time and made to serve instrumental purposes, not salvation, but wealth, status as its own end, rather than a means of spiritual relevation or salvation. Okay, let me end. The bottom line here is that, let's get this on the screen. The origins of sociology lay in a profound transformation of social life that leads to the demise of the Middle Ages and the rise of modernity in the West. The first sociologists, as both observers of the society and as participants in it, drew on the scientific revolution to analyze these tumultuous changes. And in so doing, they set an intellectual agenda for sociology, and that agenda is in many ways still intact. They asked questions that sociologists continue to ask, but we do it in new contexts and in new ways. Let me just, this slide points us to consistent themes in the sociological research agenda that are still alive and with us today. So first, what binds a society together to form a society? What creates social change? What is the relationship between an individual and their society? How do institutions shape social action? And to reference the reading from C. Wright Mills, what are the varieties of men and women in a society? And what are the sources of social power? It's a very Marxian, but also Weberian question. Now, we still ask these questions. We still use these questions to generate new insights, but now about contemporary society. And indeed, arguably, we'll see, the world is undergoing a transformation nearly as momentous as that from tradition to modern life. When we think about globalization, the global transformations and changes in the types of interdependency that that form our social relationships on global scales, the rise of global bureaucracies in Marxian terms, and the rise of global classes in Marxian terms. These are big changes from even modernity as understood by these scholars. So I think each of these questions, framed a long time ago with concerns oriented to that specific time period in which they arise, are still relevant. We still live in a social world defined by inequality, which concerned Marx. We still live in a capitalist society. We still grapple with the relationship between the individual and society in the way that Durkheim did. And so my concluding point here is that these questions still matter. Thank you very much. I will see you next time.